So it is now my pleasure to kick off the first panel, where we're going to try to provide a global context on what the international community has done for women refugees affected by COVID, but more broadly, what the international community is doing to empower refugee women and what remains to be done. We've got 30 minutes and 5 panelists, so you can all do the math. So I will ask you to keep your answers brief. And I'm going to start with Anila Noor, who is another co-founder of the GIRWL Network. And she's joining us today from The Hague. Anila is a refugee activist and researcher. She is the daughter of a Kashmiri refugee from Indian occupied Kashmir, and now lives in the Netherlands. She was the first female from her family to get a master's degree. She's been an Open Society Foundation Fellow, a member of the European Migrant Advisory Board, and she gave a TEDx, if any of you are interested, called Changing Refugee Narratives in Europe. She also founded New Women Connectors, which is a movement trying to mainstream unheard voices in migrant and refugee communities in Europe. So Anila, your work tries to address refugee representation in Europe, help improve European refugee policy. I'm curious where you see the largest gaps in terms of how the impact of COVID-19 on refugee women has been handled, and again, more broadly, gaps around the position of refugee women in European society and in European policymaking.
Thank you, Hiba. As you know, most refugees lose their dignity and give in their dreams. I'm not the one. My host city integration system had forced me to do a manual work in a factory, considering me a burden on a social assistance fund. I resisted in a positive manner across all the systematic barriers and reached where I am today, representing myself as one of the founders of GIRWL, striving to create spaces for refugee women, amplifying their voices, persuading opinion leaders and policymakers by creating, supporting, and strengthening refugee women's-led platforms around the globe. I have been resisting in my motherland as you share country's old concept and practice, considering a female as a commodity, property, dependent, or second citizen. I am the most developed work in now. My new home, I was also taken as a subject, a number, a dependent, and member of the male-headed household, not as a person who has the all abilities and capacities to make her choices. This is a system that has to be created around a notion that we are sensitive to your culture value. This so-called sensitivity has kept refugee women in the developed world as a subject whose destiny is again defined and written by male-dominant system. Therefore, along with my fellow refugee women leaders, I am leading the discourse by setting example, and we would continue our struggle until refugee women around the world are not considered by policymakers, implementation agencies, and donors as a primary object, not as an afterthought. There is a need to create a new ways of supporting and empowering refugee women that brings refugees themselves into key decision, including how, where money spent, and how to assist refugees and migrant IDPs and other in similar situations. Thus, I wish to listen today how to ensure bringing voices of refugee women to power, how to ensure policies are made around the need of refugee girls and women, and how to ensure these policies are not put into practice in a manner that they met the real needs of refugees and girls. Thank you, Hiba.
Anila, you talked about refugee women being an afterthought for aid agencies and donors and so on. How do you think that gap should be addressed? So what should the approach be, from your opinion?
Yes, as I mentioned, we need to bring these voices, their lived experience as knowledge to advance this policy, not to take them as a tokenization way, not to bring them only to listen to their voices, their stories, but also to try to understand what they're saying, because actually they are reflecting and indicating the gaps which we are having in the policies and in the there is their lack of access to their opportunities. So we need to improve by working with them as a partner, not only as a subject.
And I can say that certainly from my vantage point, watching the international aid system more broadly, this is a problem across the board, and one that the system is trying now to improve in what it calls localization, i.e. decentralizing aid and ensuring that those who are affected by these crises, and the so-called recipients of aid have a voice in shaping that response. So thank you, Anila, for those thoughts. I'm going to turn next to Madeleine Albright, who needs no introduction, of course. She served as the first Secretary of State of the United States from 1997 to 2001. She was at the time the highest ranking woman in the history of the US government. She also served as the US's ambassador to the United Nations and on President Jimmy Carter's National Security Council. She received President Obama's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, in 2012. She's a professor, she's a best-selling author. I could go on, but Secretary Albright, I think many people forget that such a powerful woman was herself a refugee who fled Czechoslovakia twice, in fact, once when it was occupied by the Nazis in 1939, again after the Soviet-sponsored communist coup after World War II. So your story is a real example of a refugee woman who once depended on governments for protection and then went on to become a global leader herself. What lessons do you draw from your personal experience about empowering refugee women?
Well, I have to say I'm totally honored to be a part of this incredible discussion. I feel a little bit like an imposter because I am a refugee, but I don't have a terrible refugee story in many ways. It's my parents who made the decisions and brought us to America. And I'll never forget sailing past the Statue of Liberty and seeing myself as a grateful American. And so the fact that I was able to have the kind of positions I had made it possible for me to speak out on this. And when I was in office, I went to refugee camps. One I will never forget was near the Khyber Pass, where a lot of the women that had escaped from the Taliban in Afghanistan and were able to tell their stories, which were unbelievable in terms of their suffering. And then later I went to a lot of refugee camps in the Balkans and saw the kinds of things, frankly, that we just saw in this video of women being the ones that did a lot of the organizing and sacrificing and helping others. I am trying now to speak out all the time. I'm a member of the International Rescue Committee board, and I speak about refugee issues all the time. I do think there is such a paradox in terms of the fact that women, and the video again showed this, are the ones that are a leading force in various camps as I've gone around. And yet at the same time, women are the biggest victims of what is going on in terms of the virus as well as the economy. By the way, there's a story in the FT today that says that the emerging markets are going to slow down even more, which means that the economic situations, which will impact on women. And so women are the victims as well as the ones that are trying to deal with the issues in terms of education, of dealing with others. And I really do think that this kind of a conference points up the numbers of women that are involved, that are out there fighting all the time on behalf of others, and at the same time are not able to pursue their careers, their potential in terms of running for office or having businesses or really getting an education. So there are an awful lot of the aspects of it. And I will listen very carefully today as the people that have more vivid experience than I do, but I am grateful that I had the opportunity to serve in a way that raises this issue, and I will continue to do that. So thank you for including me.
I could ask you questions for quite a while, but I know that Anila is very keen to ask one of her own. So I'm going to turn to you, Anila.
Yes, thank you, Hiba. Yes, ma'am, I would like to know, as you mentioned, you were yourself a refugee in 1940s and I am in 2015. But my experience made me learn that in my days, the word refugees has been becoming more stigmatized. And birds come so much in the debate in the policy of integration or when they are planning something. So what's your own experience, and have you feel this difference is getting more bigger and higher, and how we can make what's your experience in your ways of integrating, and why it's becoming more difficult to integrate it now in 2020?
Well, as I said, my period when I was doing this, or my parents, was different, and people were welcoming to refugees, especially those that were escaping communism when we came to the United States. I think the thing that is happening now, and I do say this with great sadness, is a lot of the fault of the United States and the President of the United States, who sees refugees as a burden, or even worse than that, in terms of kind of being a malignant force within society, being dependent, or being drug dealers, or so. It is a very hard time, and I speak out about it now regularly because it's ludicrous. There also are the points that I think that many countries were not prepared for refugees, even those that have a good heart, and are trying to sort out what to do. And therefore, I think it's very important for groups such as this to explain the positive aspects of people, and especially women refugees that work very hard, are willing and want to be part of the societies where they're coming, and are grateful to be there. But I do think there, unfortunately, at the moment, there's a negative aspect. And I think that that's why having this kind of a discussion is absolutely essential. Women are a positive contribution in every way, given a chance, because what we try to do is to provide care and understand the importance of not dividing people, but uniting them and putting people to work and taking care, being grateful. I think that's what women do.
If you don't mind, Secretary Albright, I'd just like to follow up on that. I think, especially with what's happening today in the United States vis-a-vis the murder of George Floyd, the fact that the US is handling the COVID-19 pandemic so poorly compared to many other countries, and of course, what you've just referenced in terms of the track record on refugee issues, let alone climate change and all the rest of it. Where do you find hope in such a dearth of leadership? What kind of optimistic message can you send in this kind of a context?
Well, I do think, by the way, I'm often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I always say I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And I worry that the message, it doesn't get out strongly enough in terms of the things that have to happen. I'm optimistic in two ways, frankly. One is that I do think that women are resilient and are willing to express what we believe, and are able to fight, rise up in a way where we have put up with not having been treated as equals, and are now working on it very hard. So the resilient aspect of women generally, but especially young women. I think that in the United States, I am really very encouraged by the whole youth movements. If we look out now in terms of what's going on, there are an awful lot of young people that are out there working hard. And I refuse to be a pessimist. I really do think that having activities such as this, where the stories get out and women prove what they're doing, and I do think one of the aspects is to understand the various parts. Education of women is important. Participation of women is important. And so my hope is that women are resilient and the young people get it.
Thank you very much, Secretary. And I know that many of the other women on this call are very grateful to have you here. I'm going to turn next to Marco Mendicino, recently appointed as Canada's Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. He's worked in Parliament for several years, but before that was a federal prosecutor. And he is, I believe, but he can correct me if I'm wrong, joining us either from Ottawa or from his constituency in Toronto. Minister, refugee, immigration and empowerment is a sensitive thing for governments. We see it all the time, really, in the countries that we cover here at the New Humanitarian, in terms of governments being wary of giving too much support to refugees out of fear of their own citizens complaining, why don't you help us before you help them kind of thing, because of financial constraints, because they don't want the refugees to get too comfortable, frankly, so that they go back home. And we've seen right-wing governments in Europe painting asylum seekers as the enemy. We saw it, as Secretary Albright just said, in the United States. And certainly today, amid COVID-19, we're seeing governments use this crisis as an excuse to push through legally dubious hardline migration policies that can't necessarily be justified. by public health concerns. So all this to say, it's a pretty difficult space for a government to operate in. And as a Canadian myself, I'm pretty proud that Canada has adopted a more progressive refugee policy, though I will note it is among those countries that have stopped asylum procedures during this pandemic. But I'd love your thoughts on how you would describe the state of international efforts to empower refugees today, and how Canada has been able to take that more progressive stance. What can others learn from that? And how have you made it work when others can't?
Well, really important questions, and that's why this morning's discussion is so timely. And thank you, Heba and to GIRWL for allowing me the opportunity to join you. And I just want to say at the outset to Secretary Albright, trust me, if there's any imposter on this panel, it's me, not you. And so, as you pointed out, Heba, I was recently sworn in on November 20th as the Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. My predecessor, the Honorable Ahmed Hussein, arrived in Canada as a refugee. My colleague, Mariam Monsef, another refugee who served as Canada's Minister for Democratic Reform and Institutions, and are both wonderful examples of how Canada is a country that offers every possible opportunities to refugees to serve at the highest levels of public office. But it's not just the work of our government that has made Canada a world leader, it is Canadians themselves. And I just want to highlight a few of the very important milestone achievements that we have accomplished over the last number of decades, responding to the largest refugee crisis since World War II by welcoming 70,000 Syrian refugees to a new home in Canada, 1,400 Yazidi and survivors of Daesh. We've supported those from the LGBTQ2 community from fleeing from Chechnya, Libyans fleeing slavery, victims of gender-based violence, the white helmet humanitarian workers. All of this, I think, reflects Canada's ongoing commitment to offering safe harbor to the world's most vulnerable who have been displaced through no fault of their own, with the partnership and the commitment of ordinary Canadians who are stepping up, who understand that not only are they able to welcome refugees, but refugees are giving back. And we're hearing about some of those examples this morning. You know, I'm seeing your image broadcast from Geneva. It takes me back to my first trip abroad in my capacity as the Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship in December of 2019, which seems like an eternity ago, to participate in the first ever Global Refugee Forum. And it was such an honor to be there with Mustafa Ayello, another refugee who landed in Canada. And we welcomed him for the first time as an official member of our delegation to reflect the fact that we collectively in government need to bring the voice of refugees to the table, that it's about moving out of the way and creating that space to allow refugees to co-develop, to co-partner in the shaping of the policies to enact the meaningful reforms that we need to see to create those opportunities. Since then, COVID-19 has effectively turned the world somewhat upside down, and there definitely have been some challenges to continuing on in this work. And your questions really allow me to highlight some of the ways in which we are navigating these uncharted waters. So a few highlights. One, despite the travel restrictions, which are not only in place in Canada, but around the world, we've continued to resettle urgent cases. And that's a real testament to the relationships that we have abroad with UNHCR, the IOM. So we're still finding pathways to settle those who are in the most extreme circumstances, and that's a good thing. Second, that for those asylum seekers who are already in Canada, we're still accepting and processing their claims. And that is a testament to our public servants who have found ways to stand up alternative processes, despite the fact that our officials are not at work. Like everybody else, we've had to leverage technology and innovation to ensure that we are still serving refugees and asylum seekers. Third, we remain committed to including refugees in the protection of vulnerable persons as part of our overall immigration plan, and I'm happy to take some questions about what that looks like in the future. Fourth, we've committed to a number of pilots, including a dedicated stream for human rights advocates, including vulnerable women and girls, where we're transitioning highly skilled refugees. Again, coming back to the need to address the longstanding stigma and stereotype that refugees are simply victims. They're not. Refugees have much to contribute. And so how we integrate refugees and their skill set into our economy is a demonstration of the way in which we're creating these new innovative opportunities. And then fifth and finally, Canada's longstanding tradition of committing to the developing world. And we know that COVID-19 has not yet fully hit developed countries, but we know that some of the modeling paints a very stark picture. So I just want to assure you and everybody who's on this panel and watching that Canada will continue to be engaged in our multilateral institutions internationally to ensure that we're providing the support in the camps elsewhere, because we know that that support is so critically needed. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Heba, and take any questions you may have. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Well, I know that one of the questions from some of the refugee women here today is how, given the leadership role that Canada has played in this space, how to leverage that. How can Canada be an ambassador for more participatory and inclusive approaches to refugee responses, and in particular with some of the members of the international community that may not be particularly on board this agenda?
Well, I do think that it begins by engaging the refugee and asylum seeking community. And I spoke about involving Mustafa. And what I'd like to do is again, create the space to ensure that refugees' voices are heard when we are creating our plans, when we're creating our policies, to try and enact the meaningful reforms that are necessary, that instills public confidence, because you're quite right. There is a degree of anxiety around how we're going to continue to resettle refugees during these unprecedented times. But what I have seen, and in particular, I want to point out one example where in Quebec, we've seen asylum seekers whose final status has not yet been determined by the Immigration Refugee Board, really roll up their sleeves and help in the response to the elderly and those who have been afflicted with COVID-19 in a way that it shows the sacrifices that they're prepared to make, notwithstanding the adversity that they've had to overcome just to getting into Canada. And what we've seen in response to that is a groundswell of support, the recognition that asylum seekers and refugees have something to contribute. And if we can weave those voices into our narrative, I believe that the confidence will remain there and we can continue to live up to that reputation that Canada has really earned and that we're really proud of.
Thank you very much, Minister. It's something we try to do in our work as well, amplifying the voices of those who are most affected and not having their stories told from elsewhere or by others. And so it's encouraging to see a government taking a leading role in making that model reality. I was also at the Global Refugee Forum and everyone was talking about how Canada had a refugee advisor to the Prime Minister, and I think that's rather unique. I'm going to stay with Canada and turning to Jacqueline O'Neill, who is Canada's first ambassador for women, peace and security, appointed also recently in 2019. And her role is essentially to advise ministers of foreign affairs, defense, and other numerous departments engaged in implementing Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. Previous to that, she was president of the Institute for Inclusive Security, which is an organization that tries to increase the inclusion of women in peace negotiations and related processes, particularly when it comes to the reform of police and military organizations. So, Ambassador, I'd love to hear from you. Canada has a feminist foreign policy, a feminist international assistance policy. How have they been applied in response to COVID-19 and particularly its impact on refugees?
Thanks, Heba, and good morning, everyone, fellow speakers, and a very special good morning to everyone watching around the world, especially our refugee sisters. Our Foreign Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, often says that a crisis doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you are. And I think that's very much true with countries as well. And that is what we've found with respect to some of the policies that you just mentioned. So over the course of many years, we've had a lot of people, including many refugee women and girls, who've advised Canada directly on what they want and what's needed. And that's resulted in a number of policies like the ones you just mentioned. And Minister Mendicino described some of the ones related to refugees in Canada. I'll talk a little bit about some of the ones abroad, and want to say, of course, we certainly aren't doing everything perfectly. We always have room to improve, and there's much more that we need to do, but getting input directly and setting up policies that value getting input directly have been a major, have really kicked in, I should say, at this point. So what does that mean? I'll name 2 ways that having some of these policies in place at the time the pandemic hit has changed or affected our response. So the first one is that we know as a default that every single issue related to COVID-19 has to be considered from a gender perspective. So we know that women are going to be impacted differently from men. We know that women in refugee camps are experiencing things different from women working in factories and cities, girls from boys, people of different races, income levels, sexual orientation. So that's the default assumption. And it's not something that we need to gather data just to prove. So we know we need disaggregated data. We've developed processes over a long time for trying to get our embassies and partners that we work with to be giving that data. And then it's taught us to ask, how are women, especially refugee women and girls, being involved actually in decision making? So as Najeeba said, more than just thinking of them as stakeholders, how are they, as the minister just said, actually co-developers? So it means we're looking for these things already. We know there are gender dynamics and we need to fund that directly. The second thing I'd say is that, we know we need to respond to the urgent and immediate aspects of the crisis. So we have to prevent the spread, we have to get immediate aid out. But what having some of these feminist policies has done is reminded us and shown us over time that we have to be equally focused on the secondary and tertiary impacts of the crisis. So our Minister for International Development, Karina Gould, often says that's what keeps her up at night. So she says, with respect to the Ebola crisis in the DRC, the Ebola crisis disrupted access to routine vaccinations because people didn't want to get to health facilities, providers were focused elsewhere, et cetera. And the result of that was that I'm done talking, twice as many people died from measles infections as did from people who died from Ebola. So we're asking how that affects girls' education. When girls are out of school, we see more recruitment into extremist groups. We see more violence in the home. We see more early enforced marriages. We're looking at food security, restrictions on farm labor and food distribution. How does that affect prices and supply shortages that always hit poor people the hardest? How does malnutrition make pandemics worse? These are the things that we're talking about, making sure we don't have what we call COVID tunnel vision, and making sure that we're looking at the longer term implications, which we know really can affect the most vulnerable and often women and girls. And so we're just delighted that this group now exists to help us with some of that analysis.
COVID tunnel vision, that's one I'm going to use in the Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Minister Gould.
I'm going to, you're just curating the good quotes. I'm going to turn next to Jacqueline Hart, who is a feminist sociologist who's been working on issues of gender equality and gender transformative change for more than 20 years. Today, she's a senior director for gender and strategy at the Women's Refugee Commission, which is an organization that tries to protect and empower women, children, and young people who are displaced by conflict and crisis. And essentially her role means that she leads the Commission's work on gender equality and inclusion. Jacqueline is joining us from New York. Jacqueline, we've talked a bit now about government and the role of government, but NGOs are obviously a huge player in this space. And so many NGOs, and we see this all the time in our reporting and our analysis, aren't yet including refugee women, refugees more broadly, refugee leaders in particular, into their work. And this is part of that broader problem I mentioned earlier in the aid system, in which people providing aid are the ones deciding what the people receiving the aid need rather than empowering them to help themselves. So I'd love your thoughts on the extent to which large international NGOs are inclusive of refugee women in their programming, not only in terms of serving them, and the ambassador just mentioned a few ways in which being really proactive about looking for the needs of refugee women can be important, but also in giving them the space to shape the programming and directly participate and have a bit of ownership. So what is the state of that level of participation and ownership, and how can NGOs do a better job of giving voice to refugee women and girls in particular?
Thank you so much to all of you for inviting my participation in this critical conversation. And as we were discussing before the event started, this is really a critical moment, and we hope it is a watershed moment for doing this work. And in the context of both the COVID pandemic, as well as Black Lives Matter and anti-racist movements, we can see, I'll add maybe another catchphrase, but we reap what we sow. And the structural inequalities that we have seen before COVID, of course, are heightened ever more in terms of who suffers the most, how marginalized people, especially women, people with disabilities, LGBTQI communities, suffer from the marginalization that existed long before. And in terms of thinking about the conversations about decolonizing aid and shifting humanitarian response, I think we can see that this is a systemic issue. So I really appreciate the opportunity to listen and contribute to this conversation. We at Women's Refugee Commission are a research and advocacy organization and work with constituents that involve both international NGO actors, as well as civil society, government, donor actors at every level of change, and really work to make what is often invisible visible to the sector for elevating the perspectives. And I think importantly, what's come out in this conversation, the critical skills and capacities that need to be part of this conversation from refugee women. As we know, there have been many, many calls for disrupting the hierarchies in the field that will enable women refugees in particular to be center to this transformation. And I think the question for all of us is, how do we actually deliver on what many of us have been calling the potential for a transformative moment in the response to displacement? And I think the critical question is, if you look at all of the analysis, especially the gender analysis across every sector of the response in COVID, we can see over and over again, whether it's in casualty livelihoods or GBV, sexual reproductive health and rights, that the centering of women's leadership, of refugee women's leadership, is the only way forward. And so then we have to ask ourselves, well, then what's necessary? And I think that the advocacy statements that are being produced are critical in that they repeatedly show that this is necessary. But what's next is actually centering the shifting of power. And we call this, localization, but I think there is a danger, I think, of sort of instrumentalizing and commodifying refugee women's leadership and networks of trust and credibility. And so what we are advocating for is, what is our role to play? And I think that it would be really interesting for us to listen to refugee women and say, well, what is the role of INGOs in this struggle? What is our appropriate role in addressing the inequities and inequalities that we can see in the response to COVID? And I wanted to mention an example from our work that I think is really a structural example that has to do with institutionalizing the shift of ownership and power. We collaborated with UNHCR in 2015 to begin a process of creating a global youth advisory council, which is made up of forcibly displaced youth from around the world. There are many wonderful elements to that, but I'll mention two in particular. Because we've done that work for years, and I heard several examples of this from my co-panelists, the work that we've done enables the work that can be done now. So this moment shows us both what we have done and what we haven't done. And we need to pay attention to those lessons learned. The Global Youth Advisory Council, because it's been this very inclusive participatory process where the youth have set the agenda and priorities. They were designated as a consultative entity in 2017 by the High Commissioner for Refugees. And we as WRC are explicitly, systematically, and with forethought shifting the power and the leadership of this entity to the two co-coordinators of the council. This is one of many examples, but it's a very concrete example. And so I would ask for the INGO community to really examine what are the processes and procedures with how we engage in partnership, not just to say that we must localize, but what does it mean to engage in partnerships that are in solidarity with and accountable to refugee women leaders who are, as everybody knows, and as my co-panelists have said, both are there before, during, and after every crisis and throughout displacement and resettlement. I think I've used up my time.
I would just offer, I'm really glad that you're using the words power, and I'm really glad that you made the connection to what's happening in the US, because I think often the localization agenda is treated as a nice to have. Wouldn't it be nice if refugees could participate? But in fact, we are talking about something much more deep-rooted, and the discussion that's emerging now within the humanitarian sector about is racism really what's behind a lack of willingness to decentralize and let go of that power that you've just described, I think is a signal to just how serious this topic is. So thank you for flagging that. I want to thank all of our first set of panelists for helping us set the scene and understand kind of the big picture in terms of some of the politics behind this. And we're now going to turn to how refugee women are responding to COVID-19 themselves. So for the first set of panelists, you're free to disconnect from Zoom. I moderate conferences like this all the time, and I must say, I put it in the chat, but this is a pretty remarkable one, in which it's not just a box ticking exercise of having a token refugee or woman give her view, but a genuine, meaningful exchange that for me is quite rare. So if we can have you all turn your video on and just acknowledge you briefly. It's like a virtual clap and a virtual selfie that we're all taking. Thank you all very much. I am now going to try. I have nothing to add other than to quote someone from the chat who said, what a powerful collection of voices that give us a lot to think about. Some of you have asked how to get in touch with GIRWL. There is an email address also in the chat, but I'll just repeat it. It's GIRWL@refugeemigrationcouncil.org. This marks the end of the conference. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And thanks for participating.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye.